Hey, everybody, this is Tom Sega from Duluth Pack, and this is the Duluth Pack podcast, Leader of the Pack. Our guest today is Dan Neff, the owner of Lake Superior Art Glass and Neff Glass. Dan, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
Oh, it's fun to have you here. And holy cow, as we've done some research, I never knew there was so many cool things you can do with glass. Folks, listen in because you're going to learn a whole bunch about glass that you never knew about before. But Dan, before we get started there, tell us all about where are you from? What was your childhood like? Where did you go to school? And then we'll work our way up to how did you get into the glass business?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of good tie-ins there with how I was raised and how I grew up. I'm from DeRange, up there in Virginia, so didn't move too far from home, but that's where it all started. And grew up learning a lot about different areas and different disciplines, really. And so everything from music and performance type art to a lot of the trades. My grandpa was a bricklayer and a stonemason, and I grew up working for him, learned a really strong work ethic and an appreciation for working with my hands. I didn't realize that at the time, but that really clicked for me, fast forward 10 years when I got into glass. But yeah, I grew up there and learned all kinds of different things, a lot of outdoor recreation as well, which eventually is what I ended up going to school for at UMD. Outdoor recreation and education. And so that was a huge passion of mine. I didn't even know that was a degree. I was honestly looking at colleges in cities that I wanted to live in. And I was definitely a hippie kid in high school. And so I was looking in Eugene, Oregon and Boulder, Colorado, and just looking at the colleges and seeing what they had to offer. And I kind of moved my timeline up because I wanted to move out of the range a little sooner. I had completed my two-year degree at Mesabi Community College up there and a semester ahead of time. And so I basically was going to hang around for an extra semester, earn some extra money, and then head somewhere else that following fall. And I finally reached the point where I said, all right, I got to get out of the house. I can't live at home any longer. And I got to go somewhere now. And so looked at Duluth and saw that outdoor recreation and education was a major. And I said, holy cow, sign me up.
So
So
what do you do in a major like that? I mean, what kind of classes do you have and is there extracurriculars that go with it?
yeah, absolutely. At the time, I don't know how much it's changed. I know it has changed since then. I don't know all the details, but at the time, there was kind of three main areas of focus that most of my classmates would end up pursuing. One is, being a guide of sorts, whether it's, canoe trips or rock climbing, whitewater rafting, you name it, any kind of guiding or the actual recreation part of that degree. The second is environmental education. And so working more at nature centers, teaching school groups, Hartley Nature Center is an example of that here in town, Boulder Lake, those kind of places. So doing that. And that was more of what my focus was. And then the third area, which is kind of a hybrid between the two, is the therapeutic recreation. And so that's taking, adjudicated youth into the wilderness and using the wilderness as a template, if you will, to kind of help recalibrate them and help them learn valuable life lessons that can hopefully help them turn their situation around. So that was the three main core areas that most of my classmates went into. And it's amazing. You would never guess, knowing that I'm an artist and a glass blower and the profession I've traveled down, how much of my degree I actually use on a somewhat regular basis. The obvious is teaching. We teach a lot of classes. But we had a class, a whole semester long class dedicated to risk management. And so I'm great at coming up with waivers and just knowing the risks and analyzing that for what we do in our classes and getting the public to handle hot glass.
Well, that's going to be interesting because I also see that you're a guy who has a beard and you're handling hot glass. So we'll get into that in a few minutes here. But so when you graduated from college, what did you do? Did you go into business right out of the chute, or did you do something else for a while?
Yeah, it was straight into full-time glass blowing. So just to back up a little bit, I had started blowing glass when I was 17 and Basically, what had led me to that is I had a friend who was an apprentice to a glassblower learning how to do it. And I was buying beads and pendants from him and making hemp necklaces out of them and selling them. So that ties into my kind of entrepreneurial spirit, which we can talk about more. But I always had a lot of entrepreneurial endeavors growing up as well. And so after a little while of doing that, I said, I'd like to learn how to make my own beads and pendants for A, just the ability to do it, and B, cut out the middleman. Why not make them myself? And so I asked if the guy would take on an apprentice, and he said no. This was 2003, and back then the internet wasn't really a valuable resource for learning how to do things much. And people back then were very secretive with glass blowing, especially the type that I specialize in. Most of those guys had to pay thousands of dollars for their apprenticeships, and no one was looking to train their competition, especially not for free. And so he said no. I said, all right, well, if there's an opportunity, let me know. And he offered a community ed class a few months later, and I signed up for that and basically waited till everyone left the class that evening and hung out with the guy till about midnight, convinced him I was a cool 17-year-old and that he should take me on as an apprentice. And that's how it all started.
No kidding. So where was this that at 17 that you were hanging out with this guy till midnight?
Yeah, this was just up on the range, right between Evelyn and Virginia. And he just had a little home studio, and he hadn't been doing it a whole lot. Honestly, he had started, I believe, in 2000. So he knew the basics, helped me figure out where to get supplies. All the things I learned in the apprenticeship were crucial to me at that point. But looking back on it, had I learned from someone who had 10 or 15 years of experience, it would have been a much different progression in my learning. But that got me into it. And so by the time I moved to Duluth in 2006, I think that first year I started selling some of my work at a couple of music festivals, Bayfront Reggae Festival, and then I went up to the Boundary Waters Blues Festival that fall and tried that out. And the next summer I said, I'm going to try to make a living at this, and asked my dad to cover my rent for spring semester so I could not work at the movie theater and build up inventory to do art shows that summer. So 2007, I started doing art fairs every summer. And so it was kind of a natural transition to go right from finishing my degree and then going to try to blow glass full time, because I'd already been doing it. I was established. I knew the ins and outs. And I said, this is the time to try it. I don't want to get 10 years into another career and say, oh man, I want to try being a glass blower for a profession, have kids and a family, and say, well, there's no way I can just, quit my job and hope I can make it as an artist and support a family. So I said, well, I'm going to try it now. And if it doesn't work, I'll use my degree.
So quit your job before you start your job and go for it.
You got it. Yeah. I was actually thinking about this. I was like, boy, I was getting ready for this. I was like, this is actually the third interview I've ever done in my life. That obviously isn't for a job, but I wanted to prepare for it too. And I was like, yeah, I've only had 2 other job interviews in my entire life, and I'm 37.
Holy cow. So you've been your own boss for a while.
Pretty much. Yep.
The good, the bad, and the ugly, right?
You got it.
So you're young, you're in college, and you ask your dad to help you cover some rent so that you can go to these art festivals, sell, start making some money. Are you doing this all out of your apartment?
Basically, yeah. That was a big part of looking at living situations here in Duluth. The first place I lived at ended up being a buddy of mine. We had gone to church retreats together in high school. And so he knew the landlord, and so I was able to set up a studio out in the garage. And the next place I moved to was Patty Steger's son. And I met him up in Ely when I was blowing glass up there sometime. And he had a place in Duluth, so I got to be friends with him. I said, hey, if I move here, I got to have a glass blowing studio in the basement. Are you all right with that? And he's like, yep, I trust you. So yeah, I had some pretty good landlords for those first few places to let me set up studios in their property.
Interesting. So then fast forward to 2012, and this is when you full-blown go into business.
Yeah. So I was on my own doing art fairs prior to that. And that's when I did a lot of my learning on a more professional level for glass blowing. 2008, when I was finishing my degree, I was out in the Puget Sound of Washington, and that whole West Coast, Pacific Northwest is a huge mecca for glass blowing. So I said, well, who's teaching classes while I'm out here? And this artist who I'd idolized for years was giving a class in Eugene, Oregon. So I went down there and took my first professional level class. And honestly, that's what really kind of initiated this whole fascination and obsession that I have with making glass marbles. So those are my specialty, and I'll show you one in a while here, but that's kind of when it started. And so from there on out, besides going to art festivals, about twice a year, I would take professional level courses from world-renowned artists, because the type of glassblowing I do is not really taught in formal education. There's 2 programs that I know of in the whole country, and at the time, they were both only for scientific glassworking. So that's training people how to make, coil condensers and vacuum chambers and all that specialized laboratory equipment that chemists and scientists need. But there's nothing focused on the artistic side of it for using a torch, which is what I really focus on.
So you're telling us all that laboratory equipment and stuff, that's blown glass?
Yeah. Yep. All handmade, very, very technically savvy glassblowers. I mean, that stuff has to be accurate to, microns sometimes. And it's just amazing how talented those artists are. I mean, they might not be creating a piece of artwork, but it's a highly talented piece of craft that they've created.
Wow, that is something that I think of it as us lay people, we haven't ever thought of that before. It's like, well, how do all these beakers and all this stuff get made?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Glass is an amazing world to delve into, and it's fascinated me for about 20 years now, actually.
Well, let's delve in. Teach us all about it, Dan.
Yeah, you bet. So yeah, really, kind of as I've alluded to, there's a few types of glass blowing. So my main focus is what we call flame working. That's using a torch to melt the glass. We use Pyrex glass, at least in our studio. There are other types, but Pyrex is the same thing that we use in cookware and laboratory ware. Pyrex is technically a brand name. It's truly called borosilicate glass, but no one has any idea what that means if I say it. So we just call it Pyrex to keep it simple. But basically, it's a glass that expands and contracts about 1/3 as much as traditional glass does. And that's why it was developed for scientific ware, so they could put Bunsen's underneath it and it wouldn't explode. But it's a pretty new form of art glass, and that's why there's not a lot of formal education for it. It was invented in 1891, the chemical composition was, but it wasn't made in colored glass for artists to use until 1990. And so, yeah, it's very, very new. And, I know artists who have been doing it for, boy, how old is he now? I think he's been doing it close to 80 years. I think he's 87 this year, and he learned from his father. But back then, in the 50s and 60s, it was all clear glass. And if it was colored, they'd apply a stain after the fact. And he actually told me, he said, oh, I had this piece of cobalt blue Pyrex glass in the 60s, and I had 4 inches of it. And I would use a 1/2 inch a year on one project because you couldn't buy colored Pyrex. And so anyway,
kidding. So it's as old as of a art as it is. Really, there's a lot of newfangled things that go on with it.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I love about it. So traditional glass blowing, that's been around for thousands of years. The Egyptians were doing that. But with Pyrex and it being so young as an art form, we're able to do things now that haven't been done before. So many things in our world, whether it's pottery or glass or you name it, the craft, if it's existed for, all of mankind, essentially, someone's probably made something almost identical to that in the last 2,000 years. It might not be documented, we don't know, but it's hard to say that someone's never done this thing before. And so with colored Pyrex, it's very obvious when these things come about, and not necessarily that I'm any of the people making those things, but there are people in the industry that they're making things that hands down have never been made in the history of civilization. So pretty cool thing to be a part of.
Dad, you're talking about Bunsen burners and you heat things, beakers, all this, and that's pretty hot. You're going to be boiling chemicals or boiling water and all that on it. So what kind of temperatures are we talking to make this molten and to be able to blow this glass?
That's a great question. Yeah, it depends on the type of glass. Pyrex has a little higher melting temperature than the traditional soda lime glass that we use in our hot shop. The hot shop is what you'll see in the front of our store as traditional glass blowing, where you start with a pot of liquid glass and gather it out on a steel pipe. That's sitting at about 2,100 degrees. And as a reference point, lava on the surface of the earth when it's coming down the side of a volcano is about 1800 degrees. So that glass is pretty much hotter than lava. The Pyrex glass has an even higher melting temperature. So that's more like 2300, 2400 degrees when we're working with that. It also cools a lot faster. So the flame that we're using to melt that glass is just shy of 5000 degrees. We're burning propane and oxygen as hot as those two gases combust, and that's what we use to melt the Pyrex.
So you can't use just a regular propane torch to do what you do?
You could, but it'd be very slow. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, the glass would not get very molten. You'd be waiting a long time to get it to move at all.
So is there a difference, or what is the difference of from when, hey, I can start working with this glass to it's getting hard. It's cooled down too much, it's getting hard. And is that even a thing? Can you reheat it and work it again? I mean, can you go up and down with temperatures, or is it once it's hardened and you are done?
Yeah, great question. It's really situational based on the glass. So the glass we use in our hot shop, its nickname is soft glass, and it's specifically designed for artistic use. It has more flux in it that helps it stay softer for longer, so artists have more time to work with it. So it's still relative to the thickness of the piece, but on average, you have anywhere from, I would say maybe 7 to 30 seconds to work on that piece of glass before you need to go back to the reheating chamber, get it warm, get it moving again. You're never really getting it back up to that 2100 degrees point. That's very, very viscous and runny. The equivalent is like honey on a 70 degree day. It's very malleable. It wants to drip if you're not spinning it. And so we never quite get it back to that point when we're working on a piece. But once it drops below 15 or 1700, you can't really do much to it. So it transitions between that, 2100 or, maybe 2000 or 1900 and 1500 pretty quickly, depending on the thickness. Now, when you go to flame working with the torch, that Pyrex glass cools even faster. So generally I have about maybe 1 to 10 seconds to work on the piece before I have to go back in and get more heat.
Do you have a preference of one or the other, where your expertise is? Because you said you have an expertise that you want to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely the flame working for me, primarily because I've done it the longest and I'm way better at it than in the hot shop. I've loved the hot shop ever since I started doing that, probably 13 or 14 years ago. And I've learned a ton from the techniques in that studio that I've been able to apply to flame working, which is really common. I mean, that's the furnace glass is the traditional glass blowing methods they've been using for thousands of years. The flame working is much younger, and so a lot of the techniques in flame working have been based on the hot shop. So I think it's incredibly valuable to know how to do both and have some proficiency in both. But I like being good at what I do, and so I like to stick with the Flamework studio as much as I can.
So how does one turn your art of blowing glass into a business?
Lots and lots of hard work and determination. I mentioned before, I've always been entrepreneurial, and most of my entrepreneurial endeavors, or at least some of them, start out as hobbies and passions. And I say, okay, well, how can I make this thing pay for itself? So I was into music and recording music in high school. I had a recording studio in my mom's basement, complete with a little red light that would come on when we were recording. And so, that was my way of like, hey, I want to record my band's music, and I know 5 other of my friends who have bands that they want to record. I'll buy the equipment, I'll charge them to record, that'll cover the cost, and then I get to record my music. So yeah, like I mentioned before, I started out going to art festivals, just trying to generate enough, money to live and buy more materials and keep doing it. And I've always been very focused on reinvesting into, my passion or the business, whatever that is. And so, it was many, many, many years before I ever started, paying myself anything. It was like, oh, if I can get more glass or newer equipment or a better tool or whatever it was, that's always what I was doing. So it started there. And honestly, for the first 10 years of blowing glass full time. So January 2009 till, 2019, basically, I was working 70 to 80 hours a week between running the business, making glass, teaching classes, going to art fairs, wearing all those hats. And that's really what helped us, get to where we are today. And 2019 is when my son was born. And that was the catalyst I needed to drop down to like 50 or 60 hours a week and 5 days a week. So that's been a great change. And I'm, finding time for more of my hobbies and passions a little bit in the small amount of free time I have.
You mean the entrepreneur doesn't work just Tuesdays and Thursdays, 10 to 2?
If only. Yeah,
that's what we all thought, right?
right. That was a really tough thing. Just, even when I was dating folks after college or in college, it was like my studio was in my house. And so I always felt like I should be working. And if I wasn't working, I was like, or, if I was doing something else, I was like, boy, I could be getting paid for this time right now instead of watching a movie or whatever it was. And so I've always had that drive to, work as hard as I could. I received some great advice years ago. There was a panel discussion at the Clyde Ironworks, and I wish I could remember who said this, but they said, just know that failure is not an option. And that really stuck with me. And that's up until that point, I realized that's what I had been doing. And then once I heard it, I was like, yeah, this is a phenomenal mantra that if you want to be self-employed, an entrepreneur, following your passion, whatever it is, just know that failure is not an option and that you will need to do whatever it takes to succeed and not fail.
Well, great advice that failure is not an option. I wish, that we have a lot of people listening to that, because it's a great statement. It's a great mantra that people, whether you're an entrepreneur or you work for somebody else, that you have that mindset every day, Dan. Folks, we're talking to Dan Neff, the owner of Lake Superior Art Glass. And by the way, his website is lakesuperiorartglass.com. Dan, a question for you. I went on your website. You sell a lot of stuff, so you obviously have income off selling things that you have made. And I'm looking here, and I'm seeing hummingbird feeders and swizzle stir sticks, soap dispensers, vases, goblets, tumblers, olive oil dispensers, and then you also do some custom orders. But let's talk about that. And how do you plan in your business a work to, hey, I need to make, do you go into a run where I'm going to be making a whole run of hummingbird feeders, and then I'll have those on my website, and then I go into the soap dispensers? Or how does that all work in your business? Because we're a production facility. I know how this works, but I'm trying to wrap my head around how you would do that, because you sell awesome products on your website.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to pick your brain sometime too, and just see what kind of techniques you've figured out for this, because it can be a challenge for us. Ideally, we would love to do, a week of the exact same thing the whole time, because we're taking a molten material and trying to replicate the same product every time out of it. And obviously it'll never be identical because they're all handmade and they're not, stamped out. There's not, it's very hard unless you're using molds and machines to make glass truly identical from one to the other. But so that being said, as artists, there's about 5 of us glassblowers that produce all the work that we make there. And it's just natural that we're going to get better at those items the more we produce them and the longer that we're producing them. So if we do 1 day of this, 1 day of that, a half a day of this, that makes for, less consistency, slower production, things like that. But sometimes it's unavoidable. Our classes are a huge part of what we do, and giving people the experience to try working with hot glass. And that kind of takes precedent over our production needs. And so as we've grown, especially moving to Canal Park, we've been a lot better about taking the winter months to get into more of those production runs to try to help us build up inventory for the summer. But come July, all bets are off. It really just depends on, what's selling fast, how much backstock we have. We have some big wholesale accounts that it takes us, 2 months to fill one of their orders. And if they put that order in August, it might take us 3 months to fill it, just because we're so busy with classes and our custom orders and things like that. So yeah, long answer short, we try to do it in runs to be efficient and increase the quality, but it can really vary on just the timing of the year.
Did you know that America's original manufacturer of canoe and kayak stabilizers was recently featured on Fox and Friends? Spring Creek Manufacturing was recognized on Fox News for being a leader in the Made in the USA industry for their top quality truck racks, the world's best camp saw, and their assortment of water sports equipment, including stabilizers for canoes, kayaks, and stand-up paddleboards, as well as their canoe seats and motor mounts. Enjoy an exclusive 15% off, yes, 15% off your next online order at springcreek.com with the code LEADER15, that is LEADER 15. Exclusions apply. Now, back to the podcast. And so then you also have your classes. Tell us all about that, and where do the classes take place? When do they take place? How long is a class, and how do people out there, listeners, find to take a class if they want to try this on their own?
Yeah, absolutely. So, our website's the best spot for it. It lists all the classes we offer, the times. They're literally 7 days a week. We have classes running, and basically whoever signs up for that class gets to pick what the project is. We've got 6 different introduction classes. Some of them are open to multiple people, like our wine goblet class, for example. If you sign up first, then when you say, hey, we're making wine goblets, and then if 4 other people want to join, they can join, but they have to make wine goblets. They couldn't do a different project. But yeah, we have about 5 time slots in each studio every single day of the week, 7 days a week. And really what our goal is to connect people to that process of working hands-on with molten glass. And, I thought it was so perfect. Earlier you said, I don't have an artistic bone in my body. And we hear that all the time. And that's what that's what we love, because we can take anyone who doesn't think they're creative, doesn't think they're artistic, and we will guide them through the process and make sure that they're successful. Because we want everyone to experience this magic of melting this material and getting to play with it and having something come out of it. So there's literally, I shouldn't say there's never failures, but if there are, we just remake it. Things happen in glassblowing. That happens to us as experts. Like we make a piece, and at the last second, something goes wrong and it shatters on the floor, and it's like, well, start over. So we do the same thing with our students, and you can even progress through our classes. We have introductions, we have intermediates, advanced, and once you've done the 3 of each of those categories, then you're into the realm of private lessons, where you come in and you say, hey, I want to make a pitcher with a handle in these colors, and we're going to take the next 60 minutes to work with you to make that happen. So really the sky's the limit. And yeah, we have tons and tons of people. We teach thousands of people how to do this every year.
Dan, let's talk a little bit about safety, because you're working around a lot of heat. And I can tell you this because I walk down Canal Park Drive, and in the summer, your front doors are open, and there is a wave of people staring in the front, watching somebody do something in there, and there's a lot of heat coming out of there. So let's talk a little about safety and what you do. You're a guy with a beard, and you're working around a lot of heat, and your beard looks pretty darn good.
Well, I keep it short. If you saw a picture of me from 15 years ago, it would look a lot different. The beard was 4 inches longer and the hair was down to the shoulders. And I definitely burned my hair at least one time when it was that long. But, honestly, it's a very safe thing to do as long as you're paying attention and you're ready to react. That's really all glassblowing is once you get good enough, you can anticipate what the glass is going to do. But usually you're just reacting and you're trying to get it to do what you want. So you're by nature paying very close attention, hopefully, in this process. And so, students always have eye protection on. That's huge. That's, whether it's the brightness of the flames in the Flamework studio, that has a special glass blowing glasses that we wear for that to filter out the orange sodium flare that kind of cuts through the orange flame so you can actually see what you're doing. And then in the hot shop, it's just safety glasses, because when that glass cools on the end of the steel pipe, when you're done with a piece, the glass kind of explodes off the end of the pipe. And we have them in buckets, but sometimes those chunks jump out of the buckets. And So we always have eye protection on. That's the biggest thing. And really, I guess the only other thing we require is closed-toed shoes, kind of for that same reason. Little bits of, not molten glass, but, maybe 400-degree glass might jump off the end of the pipe in the bucket and land in someone's sandal. So those are our two big safety things. Once in a while, we'll use a Kevlar sleeve to protect someone's arm from the radiant heat. I use those a lot making my big pieces because I'm exposed to extreme radiant heat for hours on end making some of these marbles that I create. But generally, students aren't wearing any of that protective gear. It's just not really necessary. It's such a short time that they're near that glass that, we'll make sure it's quick. And one of the things I tell students in the flame working class said, all right, well, this rod's a little bit short, but it's just perfect because once your hand starts getting hot, you've used enough of it. So that's time to be done with that piece.
There you go. You talk about marbles. Let's go back to that because that seems to be an expertise of yours. Can you walk us through what it goes into making a marble?
Yeah. So it's they're contemporary marbles for starters. People think marbles and obviously the ones that we used to play with, like the little 5/8 inch ones with colored swirls. It's not quite the same as that. So I'll give you an example here just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But essentially, I create these spheres with optical illusions inside of them. And so they appear much deeper than they really are.
So, folks, what I'm looking at is something that is probably about 1.5 to 2 inches, perfectly round. And if you've ever seen a jet engine start spinning and you see that little black thing that starts spinning inside the jet engine, that is so cool because it looks so deep. I wish everyone could see what I'm seeing right now, Dan, but that's not what I would consider a marble. Right. That thing is awesome.
So I kind of consider them the modern day paperweight because no one needs paperweights for their function. We're not holding down stacks of papers from blowing away anymore with the invention of the computer. But it's more about the piece of artwork. And what I love about marbles is that with a paperweight, you've essentially got a hemisphere to do your design within. It's got to have that flat spot on the bottom to sit. With a marble, it's a complete sphere of glass, obviously, and that gives me the whole inside to do three-dimensional techniques like that vortex that you were just looking at. But then on the back side, this one doesn't have it, but on the back side, I oftentimes do two-dimensional patterns with other colored glass. So there's essentially two canvases to this piece. There's a three-dimensional one inside, the two-dimensional one on the back. So I've got all these design possibilities to work with, but my form is always limited to a sphere. And as a perfectionist, I love that because it can be almost debilitating. I can think back to, 10, 15 years ago when I'd try to get started on thinking, oh, what am I going to make today? When you can literally make anything you want, whether you might not be good at it or not is another question. But you can say, well, I want to make a blown glass bird today. I've never made one before. You could do it. So that was hard for me as a perfectionist and someone with ADHD is there's a million ideas, but you're never going to get good at them unless you focus on a couple. And so I really took to marbles because you can still do all these techniques and explore a lot of different patterns, but you're always restricted to that sphere. And there's just something so captivating about that three-dimensional illusion in that piece of glass. That's really why people start collecting these. I would say easily 80% of my collectors have never bought a marble in their life. And they see these and they're like, holy cow, this is the most unique piece of art glass I've ever seen. I need to have one of these because I just can't get over, how visually stunning it is. I've had people buy them to leave on their desks at work because they're like, I need a 5-minute de-stressing meditation break just to not think about work. And then I can come back and be more productive. I've had hypnotherapists buy them. They're really fascinating pieces of artwork. And I never get bored of making them. And that's after 10, 15 years of focusing on these.
So Dan, the one that you just showed me, walk us through the steps in making that. First of all, how long does it take to make that piece?
So you're spot on. It's an 1.5 inch marble. It's about an hour per inch in diameter. And that's really nonstop spinning the glass time. And so a piece like this, it's done in the Flamework studio. So I start with rods of glass. I'll start with a clear rod of glass. I'll add my stripes of color to the end of that rod. I'll twist it and stretch it to a cone, and then wrap a bunch of layers around that cone to basically build the back half of the sphere. So there is a cone in there. That's what's creating that optical illusion. Or that's what's creating the pattern, rather. And then I'll melt down the rest of that clear rod, and that becomes the lens that then magnifies the pattern on the inside. And the way a lens works, especially in this situation, is that in an optical illusion, exactly, it takes your light or your vision, and it bends it, it distorts it, and it takes a longer path to reach the focal point at the bottom of the piece. So it tricks your mind into thinking, oh, well, that took 3 nanoseconds to reach the bottom. It must be 3 inches deep, or whatever, however our brain calculates that. And really, it's only 1.5 inches, but that lens bent our vision and made it take a longer path to reach the bottom. So yeah, anyway,
that is, Dan, that is so true, because when you were rotating it, that thing looked like it was 12 inches deep.
Yeah, exactly. I love having people put them in the palm of their hand, because it literally feels like they go right through. They'll start grabbing beneath their hand, thinking that it's going right through. And again, just going back to your question, it's a nonstop process. And so this is on the 1.5 inches, but that's on the small end of what I make. A lot of what I've really pushed for in the last 10, 12, 13 years here is making ones that are 4 inches and up. And for example, a softball, I think, is right around 4 inches. I can't remember the exact diameter of a softball, but those are the ones that I really like to make, because it's a really intense undertaking. It is anywhere from 4 to 7 hours nonstop spinning the glass in that 5,000 degree flame. There's no bathroom breaks. You can't stop for a second, or you'll lose the piece. And if it gets too cool, you can't come back to it. And so it takes a ton of planning. And before I make these really big ones, I plan months ahead and say, okay, this is the week where I'm going to make really large ones, because on top of the time it takes to make one, maybe if I'm lucky, I'll get two 4-inch ones done in a day. But if I do a 5-inch, that's pretty much a whole day's worth of work. But then they take about 100 hours to cool. The glass is so thick that it needs to cool really slowly. Otherwise, it's going to crack. And so the thicker it is, the slower it has to cool.
How do you cool something so slowly?
Yeah, it's just a kiln. A lot of times glass blowers call them annealers, because that's the process they're doing. People think kiln, and that's pottery, and you're heating things in a kiln. Either way, they're the same device. We're just using it to cool things slowly. And so it's all computer controlled. We'll set the program based on how thick the glass is. And then anything 4 inches or up is going to be pretty much a minimum of 100 hours to slowly bring that whole piece down in temperature.
So in northern Minnesota, like the winter we've just had, the easiest way might be just walk outside. It'd be cool in no time, but that's probably not going to work out so well for all your hard labor that you put in.
Oh yeah, you got it. We actually had a marketing coordinator a couple of years ago take a piece out of the kiln that was still warm. And she's like, oh, I'm going to it was one of our wave sculptures. And she's like, I'm going to take a picture of this in Lake Superior. And she brought it down to the lake and took some great photos. And by the time she got back to the gallery, it had cracked.
Oh, no kidding. So
Yep.
It's a calculated, gradual cool down. Who calculates that?
I couldn't tell you who was the first one that came up with these schedules. I do know there's a great example of this in the Corning Museum of Glass. So if you've ever been out to New York, go to the Corning Museum of Glass, because it is the world premier glass museum. Everything from the scientific side of it to the oldest piece of blown glass ever known to man, to the most modern glass sculptors and world famous artists today go there and teach and give demonstrations. But they've got an example of an accident in glass cooling. They were commissioned to make a lens for a telescope. And some of these telescopes here on Earth they have these lenses that are 26 feet in diameter. They're huge pieces of glass. And so they're made in these molds for casting the glass that are also kilns to cool it. Because when you have something that's 26 feet in diameter, and I think it's 3 or 4 feet thick, I mean, we're talking months of cooling. And they did the calculation and said, okay, this telescope lens needs to cool for 6 months. And after 6 months, they opened the kiln and it was cracked. So that's the one that's in the museum, and they tried it again, and I think they almost doubled the cooling time. I think it almost took a year to cool the next one.
Oh my goodness. So, Dad, as you're talking, you keep talking about blown glass, but is there also where you're blowing glass and expanding it? It's because
Yeah.
the whole glass work sounds like it's kind of called blown glass, but then there's actual blown glass. What do you call that?
That's a great question. Yeah. So it's glass blowing is the umbrella term. It kind of covers any time you're working hands-on with molten glass. So those marbles are blown glass, a paperweight is blown glass, and really it's just the simple act of blowing the glass and making it hollow or inflating air into it to shape it. So there's not a different name for not blowing into it, really. Basically, if you're controlling molten glass with your hands, you're doing a form of glass blowing, because whether it's a solid paperweight, people would call that a piece of blown glass, even though no air was put into it, or a vase that had a bunch of air blown into it to expand it. It's all under that blown glass category. But yeah, we do both at our studio, and it really just depends on what we're making. Blowing is a much more challenging physical skill set to get good at. So in our classes, 90% of the introduction classes, you will not be, well, technically 100% of the introduction classes now after COVID, you are not blowing into the glass. Our one class, so you do make something hollow, is the ornaments, but with COVID, now we use a hand pump from like a blood pressure cuff to inflate the glass so people aren't putting their mouths on the actual pipe anymore. So once you get into the intermediate or advanced classes, we'll start letting you put your mouth back on the pipe, because it's pretty hard to do more complex pieces with just a hand pump. But that's kind of how we worked around that with the new times we're living in.
Oh my gosh. Well, that was one of my questions I had as well. As you're just a neighbor of mine down the street here, and we all went through some pretty tough times, and a summer or two with a lot less traffic from the tourism and Canal Park. How did you, I guess, wade your way through those stormy waters?
Yeah, it was super challenging. Obviously, the full lockdown, that was super tough. I had a couple of arguments with my wife when she's like, well, what are you going to do if they say, shelter in place? And well, I was like, I don't care, as long as I'm the only one there. I'm going into work. Like, I can't just sit at home and do nothing. I got to keep making stuff. And so luckily it wasn't a strict, shelter in place where they were pulling people over. But I kept a couple of our core staff on, and we kept our marketing person and our GM and myself. And I shot a lot of videos every day. So our YouTube channel has a lot of great tutorials now on all the steps that go into a lot of my designs. So I did that, and we really pushed online sales and boosted that up. That was really helpful. And once we were able to open back up, things started turning around pretty quickly. The biggest challenge, I guess, was the limitations on people. So our wine goblet class, for example, it could be 6 random people from 6 households in one of those classes, or even 10, when we do bigger group classes. And so we were unable to fill our classes to the capacity we were before that, which took almost a year, I think, before that restriction was lifted, where gatherings of more than 10 people from different households could be together in a room. So that affected us for about a year. But honestly, we were really fortunate, I felt, from what I saw in Canal Park, in that a lot of people who would have taken bigger trips weren't able to take those big trips those first year, even into that second summer. And so it really seemed like we had a huge influx of local tourism, which, we always get a lot of folks from the Twin Cities or, from Wisconsin as well. But we still had a lot more people, it felt like, coming to Duluth, because it was a great tourist destination. And so that really helped carry us through. The fact we were able to, find ways to do our classes with masks on. Switching to that hand pump was huge. And then, of course, the government funding that was able to help, pick up some of the slack and help us through those times was really instrumental, because as my business has grown, I pay less and less attention to the day-to-day numbers and things like that. It's, I have people to help me with that, and it's my time is best spent making glass. And so all of a sudden I wasn't quite mentally prepared for the trailing payroll. Just like you shut down, you're still paying people for 2 weeks after that. And boy, was that a surprise at how fast those reserves went when you got everyone paid and squared away. And you're like, oh, all right, well, those reserves went quick, and we had them and we were fine and it all worked. But that was a good actual reminder of how fast that can switch gears.
So Dan, before we move on to the next section, can you tell us how everyone can find you? You talked about you made a lot of videos and a YouTube channel, that your website, you really put some effort into that so you could sell at different means, which it's interesting because I hear a common theme as we do the podcast that is like, I really, amped up my web performance and web business during that, which then continues on. But give us all your handles for social so people can see all of this cool stuff, because it is so darn cool. Give us all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, YouTube, just look up Lake Superior Art Glass, lakesuperiorartglass.com. Instagram is at LS Art Glass. We figured we wouldn't make people type in the whole thing. It's a little bit of a mouthful. Facebook, Lake Superior Art Glass, and we're getting our TikTok a little bit more active again now. Pinterest. So yeah, if you just search, I think maybe TikTok is LS Art Glass as well. That one is not one I'm super savvy with. I'm old enough now that's not another social media platform I really taken to, but luckily our marketing coordinator is good with that, so that helps. And I think those are kind of the main ones. But yeah, we're doing a lot more on YouTube. Just really trying to make sure our presence is out there and people are stumbling on us and taking lots of cool videos, because it's, as you said, it's a fascinating thing to watch. We get those crowds in the summertime of just people lined up, 10 people deep on the sidewalk watching, and we love it. And we're doing live streams too, so people can tune in from home. So yeah, just following us on any of the social media platforms is a great way to keep up with what we're doing. We've got a newsletter. And the other thing I tell people too is that our website is just a fraction of what we have in our gallery. So much of what we have is one of a kind things, because we actually feature about 50 artists from all over the country. We can't be good at all the styles of glass blowing, and everyone's got their own, tips and tricks and unique styles. And so their work, a lot of it is one of a kind. And so we don't always have the resources to photograph it, upload it, describe it, and then boom, it sells in the gallery the next day. And so now we've done all that time for nothing to put it online. So I always encourage folks whenever they can to come in person to really see the pieces. And photographs are hard to do it justice. Like the marble I was showing you, it's like you got an idea for it. This is video, that helps, but a still photo of that is just like, well, that's one angle of this really multifaceted piece.
That piece was absolutely amazing. I will be down standing on the sidewalk watching a whole bunch. I don't know if I'm ready to jump into the class yet. I'll probably hurt somebody or hurt myself. But Dan, this is just so intriguing because it's so different than what we all see or do every day, and to all of the different things you do from the marbles you talked about, which are just wicked cool, to glass icicles and pendants, and you have kids classes actually, and then just all the goblets and tumblers and vases and dispensers. I mean, it's so vast. When I started researching, I was just like, you've got to be kidding me here. This is really cool, folks. You need to go and watch all of Dan's social, follow him there, and go on the website and see this stuff, because it is absolutely amazing, Dan. We're going to switch gears on you, though. We'll get away from business a little bit. So you spend a lot of time blowing glass. When you're away from work, what's your favorite hobby?
Yeah, so it's all the things that I've been passionate about for a long time that I'm finally getting more time to explore now. Music is one of them. I've got the guitar out and it's on the wall now, at least, so I'm more inclined to pick it up and play it for my son. And that was a big part of my upbringing. So I try to play some music now and again. Outdoor recreation is a huge one. So right now, I mean, I don't know. I'm always curious to know if there's a poll that we can look at, but people who live in northern Minnesota, like how many of them actually love winter? Because I'm one of them, and most of my friends are too. Because we're all big cross country skiers. I love snowboarding. I hardly have time to do that kind of stuff in the summertime. I love mountain biking, but I get out a couple times a year usually because that's my busy season. But boy, in the wintertime, if I can get, 20, 30K in a week, I'm a happy camper. So that's a big part of it. And then like home improvement projects. I grew up doing a lot of building and trades work, whether it's, carpentry or electrical work or masonry. So I enjoy doing house projects, and we're developing a piece of property for our house right now. So I've been really enjoying clearing the land and, doing the dirt work, getting that all prepped, and just, going through the process of building a house. I mean, I love building things, and that's honestly all glass is. You're building this glass thing, and there's a certain order of steps you got to do it in to get it to turn out. And so it's anyone who can build things or, has that capacity can really work with glass because it's just broken down into all those steps. So that coincides really nicely. So yeah, those are my favorite things to do whenever I do have a little bit of time.
A little bit of time. And you know what? A lot of us up here loved winter when we were younger, and then we got older. And your body plays funny tricks on you during this cold weather. And frankly, I have nowhere else to put snow this winter, so it needs to stop soon. So this is called our pack question segment because we're going to pack in a bunch of rapid fire, Dan. Dan, what's your favorite movie you've ever watched?
I would have to say Anchorman. I don't watch movies many times, but man, that was just a classic of my youth. And boy, I still quote that movie to this day.
Favorite place you've traveled to?
That'd have to be Chile. We went down there for our honeymoon, and that was just a beautiful region to see the mountains and the culture. And yeah, it was 10 days was nowhere close to enough time down there.
Wow. Favorite artist or band? You said you're musical, so interesting to find this answer.
Yeah, this will be interesting to see how many people know of this group, but they're called the String Cheese Incident. They are a jam band that kind of followed right after Fish came out in the 90s. So they've been doing their thing for about 30 years now, I suppose. And they're just phenomenal group of musicians that play everything from traditional jam music to bluegrass to kind of calypso type beats. They're a lot of fun. So check them out if you haven't heard of them.
I promise you, being honest, I've never heard of them, Dan.
Not surprised.
Hey, we had a great bluegrass band down at Canal Park last summer. They were set up and they did a beautiful job. And the last packed question that I have for you is, Dan, what's your biggest fear?
Boy, that, it's a tough one because I don't live thinking about my fears often. I'm pretty goal oriented. The two first ones that come to mind are honestly like drowning or claustrophobia, being stuck in a cave. I watched I think it was called 13 Lives, that documentary or movie based on the true story. And boy, I haven't had a movie that made my heart race that fast in a long time. But I think if I'm being honest, probably my biggest fear is failure, and just, knowing that failure is not an option. It really just motivates me to work harder, set my goals, do whatever it takes to achieve them.
Dan, thank you so much for all of your time today. Folks, today our special guest is Dan Neff. He's the owner of Lake Superior Art Glass and Neff Glass. You can find him at lakesuperiorartglass.com, all of his social handles as well, YouTube channel. And Dan, thanks so much for being here.
You bet. Thank you, Tom.
Our pleasure. And folks, until next time, unplug from the indoors and recharge in the outdoors.